Well, today we're joined by Conservative MEP, Mr. Daniel Hannan. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us. The first question that everyone is asking is, where do you see the eurozone headed?
Well, we can now see very clearly that the euro is a recessionary instrument. I mean, it's making people poorer. It's causing deflation and emigration in the southern states. It's causing tax rises in the northern states. If we were looking at this completely logically, we would immediately move towards an orderly unbundling of the single currency. But of course, the European Union is not looking at it logically. They come at this with so much political capital and actual capital invested in it that they can't bring themselves to admit that it was a mistake. And so I'm afraid we risk the very thing they purport to fear, which is a disorderly breakup of the euro caused by having tried to keep it together for too long.
An orderly breakup, is that really the cheaper and least painful option here? I mean, there are those that would argue that a breakup would be the more expensive option. What do you think?
There are no good options from here. There are no easy outcomes when you are looking at states with the level of debt that some of the EU member states have. So we're dealing with lesser evils. But there is no question that allowing each country to return to its own currency, to start pricing its way back into the market, exporting its way back to growth, is less bad, for all that there may be some short-term and containable transitional costs, is less bad than carrying on with the current crisis.
Now, on December 9th, the EU leaders agreed, most of them at least, agreed to move on into forming a fiscal compact, and the UK used its veto to prevent any treaty changes. Now, when it comes to those who are saying that the UK probably will have less influence now in making decisions in the EU, wouldn't it have been better if the UK had just gone on board with the rest?
Well, this was the argument, of course, that we were given when the euro was launched in the first place. You have to be part of it or you'll lose all the influence. You know, the City of London will decline and so on. Well, look who was right. You know, I mean, look, there is nothing less attractive in politics than saying I told you so. But there is, actually no, there's one thing less attractive, and that is listening to the same discredited arguments from the same shameless politicians who got it wrong, who got it so badly wrong 10 years ago, and who are now trotting out exactly the same logic. What else has to happen before they accept that their logic was flawed?
Well, which logic is flawed, do you think? The economic or political logic?
Mainly the impossibility of jamming widely divergent economies into a single exchange rate and a single interest rate. There is also a democratic cost. It's not only a political cost. Last month we saw coups in 2 EU member states. In Italy, as in Greece, elected prime ministers were toppled in favour of Eurocrats, respectively a former European Commissioner and a former Vice President of the European Central Bank. They head what are called national governments, but the governments have been put together for the sole purpose of pushing through an agenda that would be rejected at a general election. So that we see the, if you like, the anti-democratic tendencies that were always there implicitly in the eurozone. We now see them explicitly. Apparatchiks in Brussels deal directly with apparatchiks in Athens and in Rome. The people and their representatives have been cut out altogether. Well,
the EU is still continuing to ask and look for help from outside of the European Union, outside of the eurozone, for money to beef up their EFSF, the ESM, those mechanisms to help the bailouts of the eurozone countries, as well as the IMF. But what do you think of this measure of trying to look for help from the outside? Will it actually help solve the problem?
I mean, this is treating a debt crisis with more debt. You don't help an indebted friend by pushing more loans on him. When a country can't meet its existing liabilities, it's crazy to extend those liabilities. We should move towards a partial orderly default in countries which simply can't meet their debts, and an agreed separation of the eurozone.
So you're saying that a euro collapse is the only solution here?
The collapse of the euro will be the beginning of a solution, or at least the end of the euro as it currently stands will be the beginning of a solution. But the real solution will come when there is a proper devolution of power, so that decisions are taken more closely to the people that they affect. If you look at what are the really successful, prosperous countries in the world, they're the little ones. The Hong Kongs, the Switzerlands, the Liechtensteins, the Channel Islands, the Monacos, the Brunei's. You know, now you could say, oh, well, they're all tax havens. That's begging the question. They became tax havens because they had low tax. Why did they have low tax? because they had the small state advantage without the duplication, without the big government. And if you want a simple explanation for why the European Union is falling behind further and further in the world economy, that's it.
The European Union would argue that because of these projects, they are in fact helping the growth, expansion and progress of member states of the European Union. Do you think the good does outweigh the bad in this case?
If EU funds were the way to growth, Greece would now be the richest country in the Union, and Germany would now be the poorest. And crowds would be marching furiously in Kiel and Hamburg and Dusseldorf, protesting about the Greek loans. Right? Just as with individuals, so with entire states. If you become dependent on subsidies from somewhere else, that saps your enterprise. You start perfectly rationally arranging your affairs around qualifying for the grants instead of creating wealth. And this is the tragedy of the recipient countries. The best and brightest people in those countries, the entrepreneurs, the people who could have done so much making things, inventing things, selling things, creating businesses in their home states, because nothing can compete with the advantages of being on the EU payroll, they all start gravitating towards either directly the Brussels bureaucracy or indirectly becoming contractors or consultants dependent on Brussels loans. We in the contributor countries grumble about it, but the real pain is felt in the recipient countries.
Now, one of the recently approved budgets is for the acquisition of new buildings for the European Parliament, for example. Do you think this spending is justified and necessary?
I mean, how crazy at a time like this, when everybody, in every member state, people are looking at how to trim budgets. Do they really need 2 cars? Can they find a cheaper mobile phone operator? All of my constituents are making these decisions. We're all seeing a real decline in living standards. And the European Union is blithely fire-hosing these euros, these millions and hundreds of millions of euros at visitors' centres and museums and, more entertainment allowances for commissioners. And, extraordinary. My favourite story of the last commission was that Herman van Rompuy and José Manuel Barroso flew to the same summit in Russia in separate private jets, leaving Brussels within 4 hours of each other. Austerity is for the street sweeper in Sligo, for the classroom assistant in Corfu. It's not for the bureaucrat.
You've been an MEP for about 12 years now. What do you know now that you didn't know before?
When we joined the European Union, we thought it would be a common market. That was the phrase that people used. And if pushed, what we meant by common market was mutual product recognition. Right? If I can sell a bottle of mineral water in Britain, I should be allowed to sell it in France or Germany, and vice versa. What we found instead is that it's a highly regulated market. So you find that in order to sell a bottle of mineral water, the bottle has to contain the following minerals, but not any of these. The volume has to be not greater than X and not less than Y. The water has to comprise the following elements. You can then find that even a bottle of mineral water that was never intended for export, that is only consumed within a very small radius of where it's bottled, can fall foul of the EU regulations and be declared illegal. And so instead of getting a common market, we have the opposite. We have a restricted market where instead of being extended, consumer choice is diminished.
So following your train of thought here, are you saying that a European Union can exist in its current form, for example, if only it decentralizes power instead of consolidating it?
Well, it wouldn't exist in anything like its present form. I mean, in 1973, which was the year that the United Kingdom joined, Western Europe was 36% of world GDP. Today, it's 25%. In 2020, it will be 15%. Why is that? The main constraint on a big, inefficient government is international competition. You can raise your taxes up to a certain point, and then the money starts going abroad to friendlier jurisdictions, and you have to cut it. You can bestow incredibly generous entitlements on your workforce, maternity leave and paternity leave in a 48-hour maximum week and so on, up to a certain point. Then the jobs start relocating. But the European Union gets you out of that problem. It obviates the challenge of external competition. It allows you to export your costs to your rivals. And you could just about see the rationale for that 50 years ago when the main competition was coming from Greece. It is, of course, ridiculous when the main competition is coming from India, China, and so on. And that's why the European Union, through this policy of centralization, of harmonization, of uniformity, has consigned itself to economic insignificance.
Well, despite being a Eurosceptic, what are the advantages that you see of the European Union and of being part of it?
The one thing that the European Union has done is it has made impossible the secret diplomacy. On any given day in Brussels, there'll be a meeting of agriculture ministers or transport ministers. It doesn't even make a press release now. It's such a normal thing for that to be happening. Okay? So that is a good thing, that we should be talking together, that we should be collaborating on matters that we can't achieve singly, that we should be arbitrating our disputes peacefully. No one is going to disagree with that. But to have that bit, you really don't need all the rest. You don't need the bureaucracy, you don't need the common agricultural policy, you don't need the common fisheries policy, you don't need the euro. All of the rest is not only irrelevant to that goal, but is actively harmful to it, because as we now see, the extent of integration, far from spreading peace and goodwill in Europe, has had the other effect. It's actually increased national antagonisms to a greater level than they've been at since the Second World War.
Now, many of the leaders right now who still want to forge on with the EU and the euro in its current form, especially German Chancellor Angela Merkel, she has equated the survival of the euro and the union to the survival of peace. What's your take on that?
The EU is a consequence rather than a cause of peace in Europe. The idea now that peace in Europe depends on these massive bureaucracies in Brussels is crazy. Peace in Europe is maintained by trade, by friendship, and above all by the fact that we are now liberal democracies rather than authoritarian countries.
Thank you.
Okay.